Welcome back. So for this lecture, we're going to continue talking about Middle English with a focus on the social and political or outer history, although there is going to be a lot of crossover between some of the linguistic situation that's happening during this time period because some of these events very specifically related to the linguistic scene that was taking place in England during this time period. So we went over a sort of timeline of some major events in the last lecture, but these are the sort of major time periods of Middle English. There's three that we're going to sort of hone in on and focus on. So the first one would be the time of the Norman Conquest and the period of time where English was in decline, where English did not have power. English in Ascent, so from 1204 to 1348, we see a rise in the use of English, and then the English becoming triumphant. So you can already see that the language aspects are very key to a lot of these major time periods as they're separated in Middle English. So going from the Norman Conquest to the rise of the printing press, we can see that English had low periods, but then also rose and became a more important language by the end of this time period. Starting with the Norman Conquest and English in decline, the Norman Conquest was super important for how the trajectory of English ended up changing, and our language would look vastly different if it wasn't for the Norman Conquest. So the Norman Conquest and William the Conqueror changed the entire course of how English would become the language that it is today. So this occurred at the end of the Old English period in 1066. English probably would have evolved more along a similar course to other Germanic languages. We would look a little bit more similar to present-day Germanic languages like German or like Dutch if we had not had this Norman Conquest take place. And in particular, the thing that we would see is that English wouldn't have the kind of French influence that it does have today as a result of this Norman Conquest. But who were the Normans? The Normans were essentially Scandinavians that were living in northern France. So much as the different Teutonic tribes had come over to the English Isles before the Old English time period, the Normans were Scandinavians that had traveled down through the continent and were living in northern France during this time. They adapted well to whatever culture they were in, so by the time they got to France, they adopted Frankish law, so this is where we get the notion of the jury. They had accepted Christianity and started to build cathedrals. They were no longer speaking their Scandinavian languages and had adopted French as a language that they were using during this time period. So by the 11th century, the 1000s, civilization and culture in Normandy had essentially become French. They had adopted a lot of the cultural aspects, they'd adopted the language. And in the years before the Norman Conquest, Normandy and England were actually very close, which is how the Norman Conquest was even able to take place. There were relationships between the different leaders, and there was a very close contact between Normandy, which was just across the English Channel from England. The Norman settlement that took place after the Norman Conquest, though, had a lot of very important consequences. So William took over the throne, and this was by conquest. And so the consequences of this were that the English nobility was essentially completely wiped out. There were no more English nobles because the Normans had come in, bringing French with them and bringing their own people with them as well. So the new nobility, the new upper classes, were imported from Normandy. So they were bringing with them their French customs, they were bringing with them their French language. And a lot of the lower ranked Normans that were part of William's army remained on the island as well. So the sort of military strength, the political strength of the Isles had become French in nature. And so this gave rise to a very specific and a very important linguistic situation in England as a result of this. So while French was the native language of the minority of people after the conquest, they were the people that controlled everything. They were in charge of the political and religious and economic and cultural aspects of the nation. And so French became a very important language. It became the predominant language that was used and the language that was used for daily interaction among the elites that were there. So the ruling class didn't know English, and they didn't try to learn English. They didn't need to learn English. They were in charge, they spoke French, and they were going to keep speaking French. Although they did probably have English-speaking nannies, English-speaking housekeepers, people that were working amongst them and working for them that did speak English as a result of this. There was still Latin used in the church, so there were still some other languages that we see during this time period. Celtic languages were still popular in Wales and Scotland, although there was probably some bilingualism at this time after the conquest took place as well. But the language of the masses, the majority of people in England still spoke English, but it had no prestige. So even though the majority of people were speaking it, it didn't have any sort of social power amongst it. So some Anglo-Saxons and some people that were English speakers were learning French as well to improve their lot in life. So this is not that much different than what we see with immigrant populations in today's time period, where when you have a dominant language and you speak a non-dominant dominant language, you may start adopting or learning the dominant language in order to get further along. And so this would have been something we would have expected at this time as well, where they would have learned some French or at least gained some aspect of French as a result of this. And this is actually what has led to a lot of the changes that we see during this time. When we see French and English happening both at the same time during this period, the most important factor for how French was maintained was that the upper class was maintaining a close connection with the continent and with England together. So there was still a lot of contact between England and the French continent. And so this was important for how French was being able to be maintained. They were able to continue speaking in French because they still had contact with other French speakers. They were in power, and so they were able to use their language as they were in power. And so during a lot of this period, the kings would take French wives. They would spend a lot of their time in France rather than in England. So they would leave the nobility and they would leave other people in England to sort of watch over things while they would go back and forth between France and England. And so a lot of the French literature of the time was produced in England, and this was for French-speaking English patrons. So we're even seeing a lot of French literature being produced. We're seeing a lot of French language being sort of maintained because of this common connection with the continent. What ended up happening is that this creates a situation of what we call diglossia in England. So diglossia is a situation where there's two languages that are used in the same place, but they're used in different situations, and there's very little overlap in usage. So we're not going to see a lot of examples where French and English are going to be spoken at the same time or by the same people or in the same contexts. There's very few examples where both languages would actually cross over with each other in the same kinds of settings. So as a result of this, a lot of the forms that we use today come from this diglossic situation. So you may recognize certain phrases like aid and abet or cease and desist. And these are things that we still say today, and this was one of the few areas where English and French would have both been important was in the court system and in law. So if you were in a court system, one of these words, aid or abet, is going to be Germanic and one of them is going to be French. And the reason that they're using both of them is so everyone in the room can understand what's happening. And we still use these phrases today as a result of a lot of our law system coming from this time period. And so you can see the use of both English and French in courts that have led to this continued use of these particular fixed phrases. Also, some of the things that have led to permanent changes in our language were the names for different kinds of animals. So beef, pork, poultry, versus things like oxen, pig, chicken, came from the idea that the French were the ones that were eating the meat, and so they would use French names for their food, things that were already on the plate. But the English peasants were the ones that were raising the animals, and they were using English names because the animals that they saw were still alive. And we still see this distinction in how we talk about things today. When we talk about food that's on our plate, we talk about it using a French origin word. When we talk about animals that are alive before their food, we talk about them using a native English word because of this diglossic situation where the English that were raising the animals used these English names, and the people that were eating the meat themselves after it was killed were the French. And so this is where we get some of these distinctions about different terms for the same kind of idea. So we see a lot of this this influence of French as it continues through even the present day. We have a lot of this influence of French over this period of several hundred years. So a lot of the lexicon is going to be imported from French. We are going to have a lot of the grammar remain English, but this is why we get a lot of our lexicon coming from the French language during this time period. After King John of England lost Normandy, so in 1204, we lost our ties to the continent. So we no longer had a king that had control over England and portions of the continent at the same time. So landowners sort of had to choose, well, do I want to stay in England or do I want to go back and have my loyalties be in France? So a lot of what ended up happening is that this loss of Normandy led to a decline in the interest of France as a place and French as a language. So the French that was spoken in England during this time was often ridiculed by the French people that were in Paris. They thought of it as not good French. And so there was a sort of break in how French became important because it wasn't connected to an area of France any longer. So the people had to choose either stay in England and continue their life there, go back to France where they may be ridiculed for the kind of French that they speak. There were a few different attempts to sort of revive French during this time period in the 12 and 1300s, but the it didn't end up working. It didn't really last. So there was an effort in the 13th century where Henry III brought hundreds of French acquaintances to England, gave them official positions, tried to get them to speak French, tried to get them to use French. But the people that he brought in were speaking Central French, so Parisian-style French, and were not liked by the Anglo-French speakers either. And it didn't really have a lot of effect on the maintenance of French in England. So even though he was interested in France and interested in French and interested in France, his efforts didn't really protect the French language as it was declining during this time period. And there were lots of other conditions that were leading to the rise of English during this time. So some of them included an increased communication between England and other areas of the world. So rather than only maintaining a connection with northern France, England was beginning to have contact with other places throughout the world. And so there was a rise in the use of English as a result of that. We start seeing some smoothing out of some different dialect differences, and this starts happening during the middle of the Middle English time period, where we're starting to see a new standard emerge based on the London dialect, although we did still see a lot of features from other areas as well. So London starts to have a little bit more influence in the language and in the spread of English. There were also popularity of these pilgrimages to the Holy Land that put lots of English-speaking people together. So Canterbury was a popular goal of pilgrims after Thomas Becket's assassination in 1170. This is what the Canterbury Tales are based on, is these different pilgrimages that are taking place. And it put people that were speaking English together as they were going on these different kinds of pilgrimages. And then another very important point is that the children of the English nobility were no longer learning French as a native language by the 13th and 14th century. So French wasn't going to continue to be passed down from generation to generation if it wasn't being learned natively. So a lot of them did still understand and did still speak French for a period of time, but it wasn't really a language that they were using natively. It wasn't a language that they were using for instruction any longer. So English started being the language that Latin was taught in instead of French. And we see the loss of French by appearance of books during this time period that were designed to teach people French. So rather than just learning it natively because you were part of the noble class, you would actually have to start learning French as either a child or later on in life. And so we start seeing these instructional books on teaching French during this time period that would show that there was a need for that that wasn't needed for earlier in the Middle English time period. So lots of conditions that are leading to English sort of gaining some social power again, gaining some more widespread usage again, French no longer being as important to England as it was during the earlier part of the Middle English time period. So the last period that we'll look at, the English becoming triumphant, is this time period where English sort of finally takes over. So French still remained an official language in England well into the second half of the 14th century, but there were a couple of very important events that sealed its fate and that guaranteed English would end up being triumphant. So this first one was the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, and then also the 100 Years' War that we had with France. So these are two very important things that sort of guaranteed that English was going to end up becoming the language that was going to take power and was going to be used by everyone. So the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, was something that began around 1348 with the first cases. There were successive outbursts every few years for about 300 years, but this first push was really the major one. So about 2/3 of Europe's population was attacked by this plague. Maybe about half of them died, and so a full third of the population in English died of the Black Death in just 3 short years. So just between 1348 and 1351, a third of the population had died from the bubonic plague. And so this created a lot of problems for society. So we lost a third of the population, so there were chronic labor shortages. So the surviving workers started to band together and started to demand higher pay. The farmers were starting to come into cities looking for work and looking for extra money. And so wages were increasing, even though the legislative efforts were there to sort of fix them and not allow the wages to go up. The demand was so high for labor that they were able to sort of force themselves and force the people that were paying them into paying them more. So the ruling class was sort of forced to give more respect to the working class because of how important they were and how needed they were. So what this ended up doing is increasing the prestige of English because it was the only language that the lower classes spoke. So they had a reason now to speak English, to learn English. The people that were in the working classes had more power because there were fewer people to do the jobs that were needed, and they were able to band together, and as a result, English became a much more important language in everyday usage. The other major event, the Hundred Years' War, overlaps with this time period and talks about a period of time with intermittent conflict between England and France. So this wasn't something that was just continuous for over 100 years, but had sort of intermittent things. So there were several successes during various periods of time, battles at Crécy and at Poitiers, at Agincourt. And so we see these dates sort of sprinkled throughout this time period. And eventually, France was defeated in England, or defeated England in France, excuse me. And so England lost all of their continental holdings. They lost all of their access to the mainland, with exception of the port of Calais. And the port of Calais even today still has some relevance with England as well. It's very close to the English islands. But before the end of this war, French was already sort of artificially maintained in England among the nobility, so people were having to learn it. They weren't being natively taught it. There were attempts to sort of force French to stay there, but it wasn't really working. Kings had been speaking English for some time again by this period. So by the mid-14th century, even the language of instruction was in English. So there really weren't any reasons for French to stick around. There really wasn't any influence of France in the same way that there was previously. And by fighting with France and losing any sort of connection to the French continent, you don't end up actually having that sort of need for French to stick around. So by the time we get to this time period, in 1362, English became an official language of legal proceedings. So rather than having things primarily in French and then that sort of diglossic situation, English is the language that's used in everything. So even in these powerful and even in these prestigious settings, we're starting to see English being used. English manuscripts are increasing enormously after this time period, so we see an extreme rise in the amount of texts that are coming out in English during this period of time as compared to the early Middle English time period. And by the 15th century, English was the most common language even in legal documents, so more so than Latin, more so than French. English was the language that we were seeing everywhere in all sorts of levels of function, in all sorts of levels of government, in everyday usage, as well as in these prestigious usage. So by the end of this time period, everyone is speaking English. And so English had supplanted French, it had supplanted any sort of Norse influence, and to an extent it had also moved out Celtic languages in some areas of Wales and Cornwall and Scotland. So we're seeing a sort of push of English a little further out than it was during the Middle English beginnings. And despite a lot of this continued dialect difference that we talked about in the last lecture, there was a standard that was emerging in London. Once English became more powerful, once it became the language of government, London sort of emerged as this logical choice because it was the center of government. So the London dialect is still the basis of all of our national standards today. So it's the London dialect that was brought into American Standard English, into Canadian English, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. Because of the Commonwealth, there's a huge influence of the London dialect on all of these other national Englishes that we still see today. And printing was first set up in London near the end of the 15th century, so because London was the center of where things started getting written, people were writing in the London dialect, and that was what was being spread. So the national standard of English ended up being based on London speech, and this was what was being disseminated throughout the country once things were printed, once there was the printed word for things to be sort of disseminated and written down and passed around. It was in this London dialect. And so the end of the Middle English time period coincides both with this printing press that sort of gives us a standard and gives us the spread of London dialect, and also Henry VIII rising to the throne as the end of the Middle English time period, because this was seen as where English has officially become this national language of England. It was assured that it was going to stick around and it wasn't going to go anywhere after that. So those are sort of the major things that had happened, and you can see how important language was with the different sort of historical events, especially during this time period. And to give just a quick little view of the influence that we see and how it changes during the Middle English time period. If we look towards the beginning of the English time period, the Middle English time period, you notice that Middle English is in the red in the left image, and that it's not very much more widespread than it would have been during the Old English time period, but we start seeing some of that influence spread into other areas by the end, so the right one being 1500 or the end of the Middle English time period. We see early modern English developing, we see it sort of spreading more into Scotland, we see it sort of pushing some Welsh back into just the far western reaches of the island, and we see Cornish also falling way down into just that little bottom corner of the island as well. So as always, if you have questions, please email me, schedule office hours, bring things to class. We'll be talking about a lot of these issues in class as well.